Hi, welcome to Neuroverse, a podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is about love on the brain, and it's our special 2-year anniversary episode.
And we decided to do a combined 2-year anniversary and Valentine's Day celebration, since our anniversary just so happens to fall on Valentine's Day.
Because what greater love is there other than neuroscience?
And sharing our passion. And what better topic is there other than love?
Yeah, exactly. So happy Valentine's Day to everyone. And let's get started. So, in the beginning, there was stress, but the romantics may call it chemistry. So the early phases of love actually represent quite extreme neurobiological states, very much associated with stress states. You know, we're all familiar with the symptoms of not being able to eat or sleep and just feeling restless overall. And so this involves the hormones on the hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis, which we also explored quite in depth on our episode on stress and stressors. And, you know, you have all of the physical symptoms of increased palpitations, heart rate, sweat, physiological state of alertness. But this stressed state also promotes social bonding. And it's these characteristics that may help overcome extreme fear over anything, which is important for the formation of social contact and attachment, and also what gives that invincible feeling that comes with love, that you can take on any challenge and you can overcome it.
It actually surprised me quite a lot that the initial responses of love, or like the initial stages in love, based on like neuroimaging studies, for example, show this involvement of cortisol early on, because I didn't really think of it as stress, because even if you're like having a crush or in love with someone and it's not necessarily very extreme, like stress isn't the first thing you might think about. Like you might not actually perceive it as stress, but it's more of like, because as we discussed in the stress episode, like stress can be actually really positive. So it's not necessarily that like every single time you're completely like sweating and panting, but it's just that little like feeling is actually physiologically stress.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't have all of the negative connotations that we may associate with stress. And another feature of this increased alertness and the activity of norepinephrine is also what contributes to the increased attention and increased memory for new stimuli, which is also why it may explain that how we can recall, you know, verbatim what our love interest tells us, or why we're able to recall the absolute most minute details. But after having this initial high, oxytocin comes and plays a role. And you could say that the peak of the cycle of love is transitioning to a more chill state, where oxytocin promotes, again, bonding, and you end up feeling more comforted and relaxed and fulfilled. And this is done through mediating several serotonin-dependent pathways which interact with oxytocin. And the administration of oxytocin appears to decrease anxiety by inhibiting amygdala activity. Now, we may begin already to see how this roller coaster ride of stress and then comfort may start looking like the beginnings of an addiction.
Yeah, for like, obviously for centuries people have been questioning what love is, and there's a lot of like psychological frameworks of how to think about love. And as you described, while the initial stages are like very stressful, then the stress subsides and it becomes more of like a comforting, loving feeling. And one like famous like framework of love is by Hendrick and Hendrick in 1992. I find it really interesting that a lot of the psychology papers I came across were like couples, like Hendrick and Hendrick and Aaron, which I'll later talk about. So I don't know, it's like, did they fall in love because they were studying love, or did they just I don't know. I just like how it's like specifically in this topic I've never before experienced multiple times.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyways, Hendrik and Hendrik in 1992, they define like 5 stages of love, and the first one is mania or obsession, which is like that stressful experience you talked about. And the second one is eros or romantic love, which is I think what we most commonly think about when we think about love. And then the third one is storge or companionate love, which is like when you've been together with someone for a long time and it turns into more of a friendship. The fourth one is pragmatic love, when it becomes more like, I don't know, practical, I guess. And then the fifth one is agape or agape, or all-giving love, which seems like the highest like heights of love you could reach. And it's interesting that it comes in like that order of gradual development. I guess most people don't actually go through all the stages with a single person, and also this is just like a framework to think about. It's not like fact, but I think it's an interesting way to encapsulate how much love can change over time with the same person, and of which the neurophysiology and the neuroscience evidence through neuroimaging mainly, and the association of brain areas that are active when people are looking at pictures of their loved ones compared to familiar friends or like strangers, they actually match really well like the psychological theories of the development of love.
Yeah, that's really interesting, all of the different frameworks, and even more interesting how, we do have quite a good amount of neurobiology to back it up and compare with. Yeah. So a really famous anthropologist, Helen Fisher, she also like investigated a lot about love.
Yeah, and she was the main research figure I came across.
Yeah, me too. And I found all of her theories very interesting. And so just to start off with, they did this investigation and found romantic love, the one that can be described as leaving someone breathless and euphoric, in about 147 different cultures and societies. And I think that's really interesting and shows that love is conserved in our biology, if I want to speak in an evolutionary sense.
I kind of hate that we're like looking at love through a scientific lens, I'm not gonna lie.
Okay.
But I also feel like even though you're kind of diminishing love by looking at it logically in a way, but also as I read more about the topic and like connected it to my neuroscience knowledge, I found it didn't really diminish it. It kind of just like made me like, yes, it's strange to put it in a framework of neurotransmitters and hormones. Essentially that's what you're reducing it down to, but I think the fact that it still doesn't explain like how you might initially be attracted, and there's still places that aren't, there's still many things that aren't answered about how it works, that it doesn't really diminish it. It just makes it even more interesting to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's still so much unknown about love, but what I did enjoy about all of the reading that I did is I thought I would encounter mainly like wishy-washy stuff and that there wouldn't be any solid conclusions, but the research is like quite solid, because pretty much every single paper that I've read, even if it's different studies, they kind of said the same thing. And so and the results that I've read, I found quite reassuring, in the sense of like, I'm not going mad, like this is normal.
But I think from my perspective, the research is written in a way that's actually really biased from like clearly a human perspective, where we're clearly trying to explain like our mania in love. And while yes, multiple studies have shown the same thing, I didn't find it that compelling, in that the brain regions that are always mentioned are firstly like very versatile, like a lot of brain regions have been implicated, and I'm also not the most convinced in general by research that suggests correlations between brain activity and self-reported measures, essentially, because usually the participants are reporting their feelings for somebody. And obviously this is the most accessible way we can study love. So I'm not questioning it in a way that I'm saying there's a better way, but as we'll expand more into, I found people often like to compare, like to say, oh, these regions that are involved in love are also implicated in goal seeking or addiction behavior. So love is like a drug. But I don't think that's necessarily the case, because it might just be that, I mean, like it's essentially just correlation on top of correlation. Like this region has been linked to this, and this, and this, and this, and also love. It doesn't mean love is addiction. It just suggests there might be a common underlying mechanism neurobiologically.
Yeah, of course. But I think it's interesting how when you look at these brain areas that are involved in like drive or motivation or reward seeking, yes, they're implicated in many other types of behavior. Like, for example, foraging could be one of them. But it's also involved in, I guess, quote unquote love. And it is correlation, and of course, like, I think there would need to be way more research done into it. And love is so much more of an all-encompassing thing. Like, I agree, like, you can't reduce it to a single neurotransmitter or behavior. But I think it is interesting to explore how it can be looked at like an addiction. Like, you do have this rise and fall. You do have very similar symptoms to drug addiction, such as withdrawal and relapse, you know. So I agree that, like, you can't just say love is a cocktail of hormones, but I guess you also can't exclude the possibility that these brain areas are involved. And I think it can be comforting to understand a bit what is going on and to think, no, I'm not like some love obsessed person. Like, neurobiologically, it has been suggested that there is this innate drive across 147 cultures, you know. So
yeah, love is universal.
So it's not definitive, but I think it's interesting to prod at. And speaking of these goal-seeking behaviors, some of the brain areas that we are talking about is, for example, in the caudate nucleus. So this is a brain area associated with reward detection, expectation, and integration of sensory experiences into social behavior, as well as the ventral tegmental area, which is associated with pleasure, focused attention, and motivation to pursue and acquire rewards. So Helen Fisher has this hypothesis that there is a drive for love, and she was trying to figure out where this drive comes from, and the ventral tegmental area is a very big candidate. And so the fact that these primitive areas of the brain are involved in romantic love is quite interesting, because another observation in these fMRI studies is that areas such as the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala have decreased activity. And I think in my case, my whole prefrontal area shuts down. There's no activity going on. And
you come to work, you do the neuroscience, you use your PFC, and then you leave work, and then you let it shut down.
Exactly. As soon as I see a love interest, zero activity detected. And it's, interestingly enough, it's this PFC area that is involved in judgment. And hence why when there's a decrease in this area, why we often say love is blind. Because it is. Yeah, and as mentioned earlier, cortisol levels rise when we have a peaked love interest, but at the same time, serotonin also becomes depleted, and it's this that leads to the mania symptoms, such as intrusive thoughts, maddening preoccupations, hopes and terrors, and, you know, the typical obsessive compulsive behaviors associated with infatuation.
The longing.
The terrible longing.
And what I find really interesting, as I've touched upon, is how love evolves over time. Like, how an initial attraction can differ from like the honeymoon phase and then a steady partner, and then like a long-term partner for many years. And so a group involving Helen Fisher as well, but much more recently, well, in 2011, they did an fMRI study in a group of long-term happily married individuals that were married for 10 to 29 years, and they showed them images of their long-term partner, and then also images of a long-term close friend and an acquaintance with a high or low familiarity, all to compare the brain activity when looking at long-term romantic partner versus a long-term friend. And they showed that activity in the brain was actually very similar in these long-term romantic partners compared to a shorter term love interest, which had been done in previous studies, and that the same regions were activated, namely the VTA, as you mentioned, the ventral tegmental area, the caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, and many other regions. Actually, there's so many, which is why I said,
I understand.
I still think it's a bit...
I see what you're saying, but I think it's interesting. Yes, there's some studies that mention like half the brain.
Yeah.
But there's others that like the same suspicious candidates keep coming up, like the ventral tegmental area.
The ventral tegmental area definitely was the one that came up the most from what I read.
Yeah.
But overall, a lot of these areas are involved in the dopamine-rich mesolimbic system, which is involved in reward learning and reward behavior and goal-directed behavior. And like these regions are known to respond to rewards like food and monetary gains and drugs. And this finding suggests that even when love on the outside isn't necessarily obsessive, in a long-term relationship, there is still this involvement of these areas that are more associated with sort of obsessive reward-seeking behavior. And so it suggests, I guess, that your partner remains rewarding when you stay in love.
Nice.
Which actually made me question if, like, where does it start? You know, like, what actually... And I think that may be even also very biological, like the initial attraction, but also very non-biological, like in that there's so many factors involved in attraction that we can't define it. But I was just wondering, like, does the reward aspect of love initiate the love, or is it something that develops over time? Like you learn to associate this attractive person as rewarding over time. So even if they then change, it's still like...
Probably.
VTA.
Yeah. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. That explains, I think, why potentially people in not healthy relationships end up staying with the same person, because they still have that, you know, learned experience with that person. Yeah. And also, I guess the thing with dopamine is, isn't it that the peak of dopamine is right before, like, the reward itself?
Yeah.
So it becomes this, like, illusion. And this actually brings me to a quote from Plato that I really like, which is, "The god of love lives in a state of need. It's a need, it's an urge, it's a homeostatic imbalance, like hunger and thirst. It's almost impossible to stamp out." And this sounds very much like the unattainable, like, dopamine loop.
Yeah. Wow, that is... Plato felt intense love.
Yes.
And also on the same study, what I found interesting was there were actually areas associated specifically with non-romantic friendship love, which I think is really nice. And that, like, that is its own separate form of love. Well, partially, like, overlapping, but also partially distinct. Type of love. And this was specifically the posterior globus pallidus was uniquely correlated with friendship-based love scores, and the insular cortex. And the insular cortex is linked with internal body representation and emotional detection. And the globus pallidus is the major site of opiate receptors, actually, which make it a sort of like hedonic hotspot. But overall, they suggest that the globus pallidus mediates sort of like liking and wanting emotions, and then the insular cortex is like our ability to reflect on our own emotions. And so together, these may represent the emotional aspects that are common to attachment bonds, like warmth and tenderness and safety, and that is more common in friendship type love.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know if this relates exactly to what you said, but something that I found interesting is that they also show that, again, prefrontal cortex, periotemporal junction, and the temporal poles are also structures responsible to identify other people's emotions, and I guess the distinction between self and other, and how when in love,
the distinction decreases.
Yeah, exactly. The distinction decreases, and this goes I guess back to that idea of merging and achieving unity with one another. And this brings me to, again, Plato, who wrote about this story that initially we were one person with 4 arms and 4 legs, but that Zeus was jealous of people's powers and split them in half, and how we spent our whole lives trying to find our other half.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's interesting that these brain areas kind of represent that.
No, I think I came across that too, about when we think of reward seeking behavior in love. I remember reading somewhere that it's like the reward itself may be the yearning for union. Like, that's the goal. And I think it's interesting to think like maybe it's a universal, innate goal for humans to seek union and like unity.
Yeah.
And, well, in a very idealistic world, I would love to believe that.
Yeah. I find it really romantic, and I think that that is the point of love. And again, Plato said love is the name for a pursuit of wholeness, and I do think that there is this desire to be understood and to find a wholeness in someone else.
Yeah, the problem is when you feel like you need to find that wholeness because you feel like you lack yourself.
Yeah.
Which is, I feel, what most people seem to experience. But that also links to another like psychological model of love is the self-expansion model. That's by Aaron and Aaron, 1986. Imagine coming up with a theory with your other half about how love expands yourself.
Yeah.
So
that's so romantic.
So they suggest that romantic love is the experience of rapid self-expansion by including somebody else into your framework of yourself. And in the initial stages, partners experience this because they learn and integrate so many new aspects about their partner. But then obviously opportunities for this expansion of self tend to decrease as couples like spend a lot more time and get to know each other. But that's why like couples who've been together for a while or who start to feel distant, maybe they often encourage you to share participation in new and exciting activities, right? And like this fits the model in that sharing those new activities, you're like continuing to expand your perception of self together with the other person. And it's like why also just shared experiences in general help so much with bonding. Yeah,
that makes so much sense. The shared experiences and how, like if you walk down a street in London or if you listen to a song that you both like shared and was meaningful towards you, like it really strikes a chord.
Yeah, but even more so if it's something that's novel and that can like expand yourself perception. Or also that will probably likely induce cortisol and then make you like re-enter the cycle. Maybe that's a way to keep love alive. You just keep re-entering the cycle. I keep thinking of like the thousands of movies which is like not necessarily a rom-com but like a romantic movie which is an action movie, like Indiana Jones, or like all like there's that love that's like initiated by a shared trauma adventure.
I also think there's something like almost epistemologically interesting about our desire to, I guess, merge into one another and find wholeness into one another, because you could have the perspective that it's all solipsism, you're just inherently alone, but I think we all have a desire to be understood and for someone to understand you, and I guess cross that epistemological gap and cross that aloneness, and this actually brings me to a quote by Fernando Pessoa, which is one of my favorite Portuguese poets. I'm going to read it in Portuguese and then the English translation. It's not that romantic actually, but we'll comment on it.
Okay.
Nunca amamos ninguém, amamos tão somente a ideia de que fazemos de alguém. É conceito nosso, em suma, é a nós mesmos que amamos. So this translated is, we never love anyone. What we love is the idea we have of someone. It's our own concept, our own selves that we love. And so, it wouldn't be a Neuroverse episode if we didn't touch upon a little bit of epistemology.
I kind of love the direction this episode is taking, I'm not gonna lie. Yeah.
And so to that I ask, to what extent is love simply a mirror of ourselves? Are we just looking at our own reflection in a vat? Are we just echoing our own selves?
Yeah. This is so, like, I've reflected on this a lot because I think it is so common of a tendency to try to see in somebody else what you wish to see in yourself, or just what you wish to see in general. And then the moment you realize this person is, like, failing your expectations, then everything goes wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, is it selfish? Is it a way of us, like, trying to cross the epistemological borders and intertwine ourselves with someone else, as Plato might suggest?
Which is it, you could argue, is also, like, the opposite of selfish, because you're losing your sense of self. Like, it's like a dissolution of the ego. But then if it's like a very fine line between it being completely egotistical and, like, losing your ego.
Or is love perhaps just a biological driver and we have no say in its emergence?
I think with the prefrontal cortex, we can't say we have no say.
Okay.
Even if our prefrontal cortex activity is known to decrease, it's still there.
Okay. Okay.
Right? Like...
Yes,
Also, I was actually speaking to someone the other day about, like... Well, because I was reading about how... they did a study in Drosophila and testing, like, alcohol drinking behavior in response to sexual activity.
I saw that paper,
And anyways, I was thinking, like, what they found, I didn't fully read the paper, but it mentioned that male Drosophila decreased their alcohol consumption when they had more sex, and if they were, like, sexually rejected, they had more alcohol consumption. And just thinking about it, it was, like, funny to relate it to humans and think, oh, that's similar. And then I was thinking, like, maybe all of these behaviors are actually very comparable across animals because they are so, like, biologically innate. And then I just said, like, love is one of the most comparable behaviors. And then I was like, no, it's not. It's, like, quite the opposite. Love is something we can think about as super human specific, because humans spend so much of their life reflecting on this mystery. And obviously we don't know what animals feel, but they don't have as complex of social relationships. And so it's a very different story. And so there is that aspect of it being biologically driven. But there, like, it is clear that because of our complex social structures in society, as well as, like, our complex social interactions on a one-to-one level, and the way our memory works, and just, like, human-specific neuromechanisms, it suggests that there is something about love that is related to those higher order functions.
But just going back to the epistemology, like, do you think it's an attempt to cross that epistemological gap, or do you think it's something else?
I honestly think love is often different with every relationship you have anyways, so there's not one way to define it. And so I think crossing the epistemological gap is a part of it, but it doesn't fully
encompass it. Okay. I think for me a big part is crossing the epistemological gap. I would say, if I were to define love, I think that would be my definition. It's the search for breaking solipsism. I think so, if I had to define it. Another aspect of love that I really resonate with is being understood. So I guess maybe that would be a second definition of love that I personally would have.
I'm not going to attempt to define it. But I think that love starts as an attraction and can develop in, like, many different ways from there. And I do get very annoyed by how the world depicts love in general, in that I think it's always depicted in a very unhealthy way. And I think it's just often depicted in a very obsessive way and, like, a very unhealthy way. So although I understand your perspective of crossing the epistemological gap, I'm hesitant because I don't believe in, like, somebody making you whole. As much as I like the romanticized idea of what Plato said with essentially describing soulmates. And I understand how that can be felt with specific people, but I don't think that is the correct definition of love, because I don't like the idea of, like, somebody completing me or me completing somebody else. And I think that, I guess you can have love in different time scales as well. I think maybe we also idealize long-term love, like love that lasts. We see it as a really good, successful thing, like, oh, you have a love that lasts, like, that's so successful. Whereas like shorter term things are still valuable experiences, but then you're like, oh, like it's all suffering, you know?
Yeah.
And I guess, yeah, my main concern is attachment. Because I won't go into it too much, but like attachment theory, I'm sure, I know people talk about it like a lot on the everyday, but it's the idea that you're basically seeking a long-term bond that mimics your parent-infant bond from when you were an infant. Have you not heard about this?
Not really.
Oh, that's like a theory that was proposed in like 1969 based on observations that Bowlby had of child caregiver relationships. And you're basically seeking an attachment figure that you're comfortable with.
Okay.
It's just like good to be aware of, because you might have certain habits of like people that you seek based on what you're used to.
Yeah.
And like this is very well known, and I think that's the problem with a lot of like, without acknowledging that, then you will very easily fall into an attachment style or like a relationship that isn't actually beneficial to your development, because it's hard to escape unhealthy love seeking when that's all you know. Yeah. And I think that the way that the media depicts love, for example, or TV shows and books, is often that toxic type of love. Yeah. And it doesn't show like... Also on this note, like I'm actually listening to an audiobook now called The Mastery of Love, which I have listened to before, and it's just so good. So I really highly recommend it, because it's all about attachment, and it's based on Toltec, like ancient Toltec wisdom, and it's all about how true love is not the attachment type of love that we normally think about, and so that's where my perspective is really coming from.
Yeah, makes sense. That's really interesting. I also wanted to quickly maybe talk about heartbreak on the brain. And so...
Or maybe it should be called brain break.
Brain break. Yeah. I think what's interesting about heartbreak on the brain is that when you have an addiction to anything, like whether it's coffee, alcohol, drugs, and you try to get off it, of course you have the typical withdrawal, temptation symptoms. But with love, it's so much harder, because not only you have the chemical effects, like all of the hormones, you also have the emotional impact that you may not have with like coffee, for example. And so it's just withdrawal on several different scales, and it's a habit. It's like going on Instagram, and like you pick up your phone, you go on it, and you don't even realize you've gone on it, and you have someone that maybe you see a few times a week, or you get a few messages a day from, and all of a sudden it's gone. It's this emptiness, and you lose a shared language, you lose a meaning and understanding only you shared. And I think that's something that's so unique to love that I think you don't really have with anything else. And the same driver that makes you fall in love, the same hormones that have that initial stressor, become even more active with a heartbreak. That goal-driven behavior just amplifies, and you overthink what else you could have done, and you obsess over every detail, and you can't sleep and you can't eat.
Yeah, I found a study that was looking at people who had been rejected recently, but were still infatuated with the person, and then they showed them pictures of that person and then other unfamiliar faces or people. And they also looked at a group that was happily in love to compare, and they found that activity in a certain area in the left ventral putamen was higher as the relationship increased in duration. But in the rejected and loved group, the reverse occurred. So the more days after the breakup, there was less activity in this area. And I think that's quite like promising, because it suggests that on a neurobiological level, there's like that flexibility in your brain activity in response to a specific person that helps you actually lessen your attachment to the person. And it's the same area that probably is involved in increasing the attachment to this person as you spend more time with them.
That's good news.
Yeah, so right?
There is hope, and time heals.
Yeah, time heals, but I think it is that memory aspect that is the most mania-inducing, let's call it, in a breakup, because like, I know, like, everyone will rethink everything that they've shared with this person, and that is so much compared to, like, all the times you drank coffee.
Yeah.
It's just not quite the same. Like, all the dates you've been on, all the places you've traveled together, all of the, like, memories you've shared is so rich. It's, like, the richest.
Yeah. It's the richest circuitry.
Yeah.
Because it's the amygdala, the memory, the contextual information. You make all of these associations. Your memory is insanely enhanced.
Like you said in the beginning of the episode, it's even more so enhanced because of that cortisol and because of the dopamine. And that these are all, like, additives on modulating memory formation. So,
yeah. And then it's...
Oh my gosh, that reminds me of the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. I swear I take every opportunity to mention this movie.
I haven't seen it, but I need to see it.
Yeah, I've definitely mentioned it in at least one other Neuroverse episode, because it's all about how, following a breakup, there is a service that removes this person from your memory. Yeah. I won't spoil it any further for any of the listeners who haven't watched it, but... Oh, it's one of my favorite movies, and I think that explores love in a really interesting way about whether or not you can or want to erase a person fully.
Yeah, I definitely have to watch it. It's on my list to watch it. I was just going to say one more thing, in that these brain areas that are involved with the increased cortisol and stress and memory and all of this and also other brain areas that are goal directed, and if you're out of love, you no longer have, like, a goal to work towards. So the area in your brain that is most active about go-getting and motivation and working for it, like, you have nothing to work towards. It's the opposite. You need to stop it. But that's the time that area is most activated. It's such a cruel irony. Yeah. And with that, it's been really interesting discussing love, the neurobiology, the philosophy, the psychology.
There's definitely a lot more to say about it because it's such a mystery still. But I'm really happy we got to do this Valentine's Day 2-year anniversary. Oh, wow, it sounds like we're married to our podcast. That's... I don't know how I feel about that.
I don't think it sounds merry.
It's fine. Let's celebrate love.
Yeah.
Happy Valentine's Day to you all.
Happy Valentine's Day.
And thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And be sure to share this episode with your friends. And we really appreciate it. And check us out on our Instagram and Twitter at Neuroverse_pod. And check out our website, neuroversepod.com.
Thanks for listening.